She asked me to marry her, not for love, because she had no one else. I was up to my elbows in gear oil, the smell of diesel and old hay thick in the air, when the SUV hit the gravel. Tires crunched, dust rose, and for a second I thought it was one of the guys coming by to borrow a wrench. Then a woman in a dark coat stepped out, hair pulled back like she had somewhere important to be, and she walked toward me with a folder in her hand and a look of a person who had learned to make decisions fast. "Mr. Miller," she said. Her voice was precise, unrounded, the kind you hear in boardrooms and depositions. She carried a briefcase like a shield. Up close, the blazer looked new. Her hands were not the hands of someone who had shoveled manure or wrestled a leaking radiato R. They were trimmed, competent hands. She held out the folder the way someone holds a prefabricated solution. "I don't know you," I replied, wiping my hands on the back of my coveralls. The mechanic in me stood ready to test her. The farmer in me was suspicious of strangers with clean shoes. "Claire Whitmore," she said, "I need you to marry me, tomorrow, at the county courthouse." It was a sentence that should have been incongruous with the smell of hydraulic fluid and the loose world of a small farm, except she wasn't smiling. There was no flourish, no explanation laced in charm. Her eyes were flat and urgent. The folder thudded in my hands when she passed it over. On top, a will, a trust clause circled in ink, a memo from a law firm. I skimmed until the lines blurred. The gist hit me like a slap. If she wasn't married by the time the trustees met, an emergency clause would hand operational control of the Whitmore group to a committee, and Ryan Whitmore, her cousin, would grab the chair like a drowning man grabs a life preserver. "Why me?" I asked. "You run land. You own a little place down the county road. Your name's Miller. You have a standing presence here," she said. She didn't phrase it as a plea. She stated it like a fact she had already accounted for. "They'll accept a marriage between family lines. You sign as a husband, and I'll sign as a wife. It's legal. It keeps the company from falling into certain hands." I pictured Ryan. The family gossip had always mentioned him in the kind of sentences people use to explain bad things. Ambitious cousin, always had a plan. He had the Whitmore muscle, lawyers, contacts, and the kind of charming menace that worked a room and then cut a throat. I thought of what control by the wrong people would mean for farms like mine. The Whitmore group had 1,000 ways to tilt grain contracts and set prices. If Ryan took the company, his first acts might be to fold up smaller operations, to offer buyouts that sounded friendly and felt like pressure to someone who'd never been good at saying no. "We'd be married?" I said. The word felt heavy. "As married as the law makes two people," she said. "I don't want more than that at first. I need a witness, a legal marriage. I have a window of 24 hours before the trustees convene." I thought of my family. My parents depended on the farm. The mortgage was an argument in numbers. I thought of my own stubborn streak, the part of me that kept the place because my father couldn't anymore, and because there was something about the horizon that put the rest of the world in perspective. I imagined Ryan in the boardroom, restructuring lines on a spreadsheet that didn't include any of us. For a flash that felt like home, spiteful and protective both, I said, "All right." We went to the courthouse the next morning. The county clock over the brick face said 9 when we walked in. Tom, who lived 2 farms down and whose dogs thought every stranger could be an enemy unless proven otherwise, came along and signed as witness because he owed me for the time I fixed his tractor last spring. The clerk clicked pens, a judge muttered the necessary phrases, and for the cost of a marriage license and 30 minutes of scripted words, we were married in the eyes of the county and the law. It was all legal. It was supposed to be temporary. Back on my gravel road, Claire slid into the passenger seat of an old pickup like she belonged there, the briefcase on her lap. There was an arrangement, quick, businesslike. She laid out rules. No social media posts, no public appearances together unless necessary, separate bedrooms and a clear timeline. She would manage meetings and court filings from the city. I would keep the farm running like I always did. The handshake that sealed it was firm. We promised no romantic entanglement. It felt strange and sensible, like building a wall to hold a storm back. For the first few weeks we were careful. Claire flew to meetings and returned with briefcases and tired eyes. I woke before the sun to throw grain, to check wiring, to check fences. She brought a Neiman Marcus jacket to muddy boots, and I handed her the rope for the fence when the last calf needed wrangling. We ate in shifts, I on a battered enamel plate in the kitchen, she at the farmhouse table checking emails that blinked like backroom lights. Our conversations were practical. How to keep the milking schedule, what a leaching field was, when the combine would need the belts tightened. She learned farm language the way someone learns a new code, haltingly, with a pen and small corrections. A detail that made me smile and then kept me up nights was how she burned eggs. She had the air of someone who could manage multi-million-dollar audits and recall a clause from a 2-inch legal brief. But on Saturday mornings, she couldn't make scrambled eggs to save her life. They stuck like little sunburns to the skillet, and she laughed when I rescued them with a spatula. She cursed in that precise way when she pricked her finger on a wire, an oath that belonged to every farmer's lexicon, and I realized she neither wanted nor needed to be invincible. She was simply a person sitting at my table, swallowing coffee, hair messy, and watching the horizon in a way that looked like it might be new to her. It was in small, domestic things that the distance softened. One night, after the tractors were parked and the moon had flattened itself over the field, she sat on the back steps rubbing smoke out of her eyes. The farm had a smell to it that got under the skin. Cut straw iron, the faint sourness of cattle. And she breathed it like someone trying to memorize a face. "You ever miss the city?" I asked. "Sometimes I'm afraid I'll forget a phone number," she said, smiling. "Sometimes I think the city misses me back." Then she asked me about my father, about the stories stitched into the fields here. I told her the way I remembered his hands, the way he could fix a pump with nothing but a twist and a knowing. She listened, not looking to consult a calendar in her head, but to keep a place for the story. We were moving with the kind of slow gravity that pulls things into orbit. That orbit got disrupted the night the irrigation lines were cut. It was almost midnight when the neighbor's dog started barking, long and nervous, a sound that meant the darkness had someone else in it. I grabbed a flashlight and went out to the field. The lines that carried water had been slashed clean through, the pale hoses like severed veins. There were footprints that guttered away toward the hedge, and the smell of oil, fresh and deliberate. That was not a move by chance. That was someone who wanted damage, not mere mischief. Claire didn't bat an eye when I told her. She called people while I patched lines with my hands numb from the cold. The sheriff came, and an investigator. They took samples, wrote notes, and tiptoed around our property like surgeons. When the news vans arrived the next morning, the headline suggested coincidence. The injector of suspicion was always 2 degrees removed. I had learned the way headlines could build a story that wasn't mine. Then came the shed. By noon the next week, a neighbor yelled from the road. Smoke had been darkening the eastern sky, and when we sprinted across the yard, the old equipment shed was a smear of orange. The roof sagged, and heat pulled at the air like a living thing. We put out the flames with hoses and shovels and a panicked strength I hadn't known I had. The old combine was ruined. A box of receipts and building invoices steamed in the ruins, charred at the edges. Claire stood there covered in soot, and I saw something in her face I hadn't seen before. The blankness that comes when you watch a plan you depend on unravel right before your eyes. "It was arson," the investigator said, and the sheriff's boots made tracks in the mud. The insurance adjusters began the language of loss, depreciation, replacement value. Someone put a camera from the county road onto a neighbor's fence line, and we watched, frames flickering like a bad film. A figure crossed the field late at night. It wasn't my figure. It wasn't Tom's. The hands turned a flashlight and revealed a profile like someone who knew exactly where to cut to make the damage permanent. Ryan's name had been quiet until then. After the shed burned, it became louder. He denied everything. His lawyers denied everything with the confidence that comes from being able to bill by the hour. He ran op-eds in the local paper about efficiency and modernization. He painted himself as the only person who could save the company from inefficient sentimentality. It felt like watching a man paint a snake and then try to pass it off as a garden ornament. We had 48 hours, Claire said, when Ryan demanded an emergency verification hearing. The board would convene to decide whether the marriage was a sham, whether the trust clause had been manipulated, whether the Whitmore group needed oversight. The hearing promised to be formal, sterile, ruthless. If the board decided the marriage was fraudulent, Claire's legal hold on the company would be shaky. If the board decided for Ryan, they might install him as steward, and the contracts that fed my family would change overnight. We scrambled. We called everyone who might be a witness. Tom walked through the siding of his own fence and said without flourish that he'd seen a car the night of the irrigation cut and the people involved. A kid from down the road had a dash cam. His pickup had caught a plate number. The investigator brought in a grainy image of a vehicle idling in the hedgerow the night the shed went up. There was a surveillance camera on the Whitmore corporate lot. Claire had asked them to pull footage to help determine who had been mucking about late at night near their storage. It showed Ryan's car near the maintenance bay, the night before the arson. In a clip, a voice on an audio file, a clipped message left on a contractor's phone, mentioned making the field more manageable, quietly. There were transfers on a small contractor's account that matched the timeline for the supplies used to cut the lines and to buy ignition materials. Transfers that traced back to a shell entity connected to Ryan. It was circumstantial if you looked at each piece alone, but together it started to read like a map. The hearing room smelled like stale coffee and papers. Cameras dotted the corners like insects. Board members sat like judges of a small kingdom. Lawyers in crisp suits chewed on phrases like currency. Ryan's side was polished. He looked like a man who had never had to smell smoke or patch a hose at midnight. He reclined as if in a chair that had always been reserved for him. Purposefully fraudulent marriage, Ryan's lawyer asked, with the precise contempt of someone who could see the whole board as an audience. Claire rose. Her voice didn't waver. She told the board what everyone already knew in part, that the marriage had been a legal arrangement, something meant to hold a line while they sorted ownership and oversight. She said the word temporary, even as I felt the blood in my ears. Then she did something that made the room feel suddenly too small. She told them about the nights on my porch, about how I'd shown her the broken fence and how I had cussed under my breath when the calf had slipped its tag. She told them about the way my father had taught me to wrap a wire so it wouldn't cut through on a thawing morning. She told them how I turned my farm lights off to look at the stars, and how we once stood there in the dark and didn't say anything for a long time. At first it was necessity, she said, looking at the board and then at me. But then, over these months, he has been my constant. He has been honest when there were questions to be asked, steady when I needed a hand. And more than that, he's shown me what it's like to put land and people ahead of profit. I am married to him now. Yes, because of an emergency clause in a trust. But I am not married to him solely for the paperwork. I chose this and I choose him now, not for convenience, but because he is the person I trust with my life and my work. Silence has weight. In that packed room it was heavy as the wind before a storm. You could hear the rustle of paper. Ryan's smile looked smaller. His lawyers shuffled. The defense took their turn. They played clips and raised doubts and peered at contracts like vultures. They asked about timing and intent, but then we played the footage. A still frame of Ryan's license plate, cross-referenced with the contractor's receipt, and the audio message in which a recorded voice, timbre and cadence matched by the investigator, gave explicit instructions about making sure things look like an accident. A recorded transfer from a supposed maintenance company went to a shell account that, traced through a web of intermediaries, led to a trust controlled by Ryan. We brought in neighbors to swear to seeing him 2 nights before the irrigation cut and the night of the fire. Tom testified about the dash cam. The investigator walked the board through the timeline. Legal outcomes aren't lightning strikes. They are slow arrows that find gaps. The pieces we had were not one definitive blow, but together they were a net. The sheriff and county prosecutor watched from the back and made notes. When the evidence piled up, when the pattern formed and a motive emerged, the possibility of a hostile takeover by Ryan, people began to sit differently. The board's hostility cooled into a more careful curiosity. I remember the look on some faces like the first time a farmer realizes a spring hasn't run in years, and that being wrong means adjusting everything. When the emergency hearing concluded, the board voted to validate the marriage and to refer the matter to the county prosecutor for criminal investigation into the acts of sabotage and arson. Ryan wasn't led out in cuffs that day. That wasn't the kind of movie this place did. But he was publicly stripped of the immediate push he had tried to make for the chair. The Whitmore Group instituted an oversight committee. Claire retained operational control and put in place measures that protected small suppliers and firms from the sort of predatory contracts he'd been courting. The fallout took months. Ryan hired more lawyers. He tried to discredit witnesses with the kind of insinuations that make people retreat. Some firebrands on the internet tried to turn the story into a spectacle. We ignored the noise. Inside our farmhouse, the routines realigned. Claire volunteered to sit through my generator's list of issues. I learned to schedule calls around harvest and to listen differently when she explained a cash flow projection. We rebuilt the shed, more solid this time. Neighbors brought nails and hands and meals. There was nothing theatrical about it. It was work and coffee and the steady pressure of grain being dried under a sky that had no interest in human temperaments. There was a day in the late fall when Claire proposed an idea that had nothing to do with boards or lawyers. We were sitting on the porch with flannel against the evening chill. The farm had the soft ache of a place recovering. I had a cup of black coffee that tasted like the old years, and a slice of pie she had brought from a bakery in town, because she declared she was done with my burned eggs experiment for now. "Do you want to come up to the house tomorrow and help me sign a change to the company's supplier charter?" she asked. Her face was the same when she asked me about barns as when she asked about staff redundancies. Curious, practical, and somehow tentative. "I already do," I said. It felt like something bigger than policy. It felt like an admission. If it's help you want, it's there. We started approaching life differently. Claire didn't come to the farm wearing armor anymore. She came with a pair of old work gloves she'd stolen from my shed and a bright, ridiculous hat she swore made her invisible to birds. She'd hold the gate for me in the mornings, and I'd stick my hand into her jacket when there was a winter wind. People called us husband and wife with a casualness that suggested a story long told. Some of them were surprised when they heard how it had started. In private, we kept reminding each other that it had begun as a necessity and that it had become a choice. Saying it out loud kept us honest. We talked about vows not as ceremony but as daily acts, telling the truth, fixing things, showing up. Which is why when I suggested a small wedding, I meant it literally. No hall, no band, no big catering. We chose late September because the sky that month did something to the light, like it softened everything around it. The guest list was neighbors. A few Whitmore Group people who had stayed loyal. My parents, Tom, and the county clerk who'd married us the first time, and who agreed to officiate again in a more public way. On the day, we set chairs on the north side of the field. Someone donated a string of lights. The generator hummed like a patient animal. People brought pies and casseroles and chairs with stories in their fabric. My mother wore a dress she'd saved for funerals and weddings both. Claire's mother didn't come. Family lines had stretched tight like rope and had not been mended yet, but community had come in place of an entire gallery of relations. The minister read something about seasons, and the county clerk joked about the paperwork being easier the second time around. We spoke vows that were small and true. I promised to be honest and to ask for help when I needed it. She promised to bring the ledger and then listen when I wanted to change things, because they made sense for our land. We laughed about the first marriage, and how odd it had been to sign because of a clause in a trust. We both said we had not expected love when the marriage began. That choice had grown slow and stubborn like wheat through winter. Standing in the open, under a sky that had watched both our worst and our best, I realized how fragile and ordinary everything looked. The crisis hadn't made us a story. It had made us neighbors, friends, partners. We were two people who'd made a decision together and then lived into it. The legal necessity had been the door that opened the rest of the house. After the ceremony, we sat on the porch and the warm air slid over our legs. The fields were a quilt of indentations, and the horizon was a company of stars. Claire leaned her head on my shoulder and pointed to Orion's belt, and then admitted she had never known how to pick the brightest star and call it a compass. I showed her how my father had taught me to use constellations to predict weather, and she listened like a scientist reading data in a new language. "I'm glad you asked me," she said eventually, not as a recollection but as a present, "because I had no one else to ask. But I'm even gladder that you said yes." It was a sentence that kept the truth intact. Necessity at the start, choice in the arc. Love wasn't a sudden ignition. It was the slow heating of the same skillet until the eggs turned from stuck to perfect. It was choosing the same person on ordinary days. The Whitmore group changed in ways that mattered. Claire pushed for a charter that protected small suppliers, put transparent bidding practices into place, and created a relief fund for farms that had emergency losses. She ran audits that made some people uncomfortable and delighted others. She insisted that the company commit to fair contracts in exchange for scaled investments. Some people called it naive, others called it courageous. I called it her refusing to let the company be a force that swallowed the land she loved. Ryan eventually faced charges. The prosecutor's office moved slower than we'd have liked, crisscrossed with motions and legal wrangling. But the evidence we collected, the footage, the receipts, the audio, followed him like a shadow until it found purchase. He was removed from immediate corporate reach, and the legal consequences rippled. He hired lawyers and paid fines and, in private, probably rehearsed speeches about being misunderstood. He kept fighting in courtrooms that felt too small for the kind of temper he harbored. For us, the world kept a shape. Neighbors fixing fences, children racing through fields, the combine humming like a purr as harvest finally came. When harvest finished that year, and the fields lay smooth and ordered, I realized the farm had, in a way, been a test. We had weathered sabotage, fire, legal eyes, and gossip. We had rebuilt a shed with better beams and laughed about the ridge board that ended up 2 inches off because someone misread the blueprint. We'd held a board hearing in which I sat and listened to people speak about corporate governance like it was a foreign country being mapped. Through it all, Claire and I kept choosing each other, not in a breathless cinematic moment, but in the small, practical ways that keep a life upright. People sometimes ask how you can tell the difference between obligation and love. I think it's in the lightness that follows a difficult night. It's in how you share the weight. Obligation bends you to necessity. Love makes necessity seem like a poor draft of a life you could make better. It becomes, eventually, what you want. On an ordinary Monday, after coffee and before the machines woke for the day, I walked the boundary of my property. Claire came with me, in jeans and with a thermos tucked under her arm. We stopped at the corner by the old oak and looked out over the land. The morning had a thin, honest light, the kind that picks out the bones of things. She reached for my hand without asking, simple as a handshake. "If you had turned me down that day in the yard, would any of this have happened?" she asked. "Probably not. Ryan would have had a nicer office," I said, and she laughed. The sound sat in the field like a small bird. "You'd have hated him," she added, and I pictured a different life, one where I sat and watched the horizon but sent other people to fight my fights. I couldn't see that me being any braver. We married again because we wanted people to know it wasn't a contract anymore. We rebuilt a shed because wood is honest and requires a certain kind of truth. We fought in courtrooms because people set fires and cut lines, and because someone needed to stay to prove that there are things worth protecting that are not stockholders' returns. And in that work, we found each other. Sometimes I still think about that first handshake, the folder with the trust clause tapping the palm of my hand. I think about how a person with a briefcase can be surprised by a night on a porch. I think about how the world often makes us choose between what is useful and what is true, and how the two can, with enough stubborn care, be the same. If you want to know how the hearing turned out and how the rest of it happened, stay with me. It's the kind of story that gets smaller in the retelling if you skip the details. In the end, the small wedding, the rebuilt shed, and the policies Claire put in place weren't grand gestures. They were steady, ordinary things that kept people in business and fields under stewardship. We learned to argue without insulting each other, to call when one of us was late. We argued about where to put the new bee boxes, and later she corrected me when I called them hives, because she had read an article on sustainable pollination, and now insisted on the more accurate term. Little corrections like that, offered kindly, are love in action. The last scene I carry like a photograph is simple. A porch light swung low, the smell of something cooking, 2 mugs cooling between our hands. Claire's heels hung on the edge of the steps, and my boots were caked with the kind of mud that tells you a rain passed through the night. We listened to the corn drying and to a distant dog bark. She leaned her head against my shoulder and said, "You did a good thing saying yes." "I just did the sensible thing," I said. "As usual." She smiled like that was enough. There was a warmth in the porch light that made our shadows lean into each other. The title of the story is true. She had asked me to marry her because she had no one else. What the title doesn't say is that the asking didn't end there. She asked me every day in small things, and I, after a while, asked her back in the same ways. We stopped pretending that the marriage was only a legal container. We started living it as a choice, as a room we built together. If this story moved you or made you think about the quiet ways people choose each other, like and subscribe for more long-form stories. There are a lot of small towns and quiet fights out there, and I'm telling the ones I know.